Okay. Well, Segole Hodiwa ni Yukwats. My name is Matt, but my Oneida name is Hodiwa, which means string bean. My grandmother gave me this name. My grandmother was a clan mother in the Oneida Indian Nation in upstate New York. The Oneidas are part of what is commonly referred to as the Iroquois Confederacy, which makes up several tribes. Now, you may think string bean is a funny name, and it probably tells you something about what I looked like as a child. Maybe I still look that way a little bit, but maybe not nearly as much as I did when I was younger. Now, you may think that's a funny name, but my brother's name is Hanadaganchuns, which means one who tears the world apart. Right? So I think I got off good with regards to the names. And it probably tells you a little bit about something about my brother as well, especially as a child. Interestingly, my brother is a civil engineer, so now he's one who actually builds, right? So he's actually doing a bit of the opposite of what his name is. But I'm Oneida, and I'm proud of it. It's a part of my identity. But it's not the only part of my identity. The other part of my identity comes from the other side of my family, and I have two descendants that came across the ocean and were on the Mayflower, the Brewsters and the Aldens. It's also an important part of my identity, and I'm proud of it. Yet at the same time, these two identities, and if you think about it, have some contrasting aspects to them. Right? And it can be a little bit difficult to reconcile. And I think, or at least I'm hoping today, that you can resonate with that. Our identities are complex. They have different components to it. Some parts of our identity are prominent. Some of them, parts of our identity, are less prominent. Sometimes parts of our identity clash with one another. It's challenged, and we struggle to reconcile these various components of our identity. And what I want to talk about today is this identity journey that I've been on, largely talking about my vocational identity and how I've tried to make sense of various points along the way, and this adventure that I've been on, which is by no means finished, but has had a lot of twists and turns and threats and challenges and a lot of reflection as to who I am. Now, when we think about identity, many times a starting place is to think about where we're friends or where we're from. One thing I love about being in Michigan is that so many people that I meet in Michigan love being in Michigan. They love being Michiganders, and they're very proud of being from Michigan. Now, when you ask me where I am from, my eyes glaze over a little bit because I don't have a clear answer to where I am from. And typically my response is, that's a very complex question. I was born in Montana on the Crow Agency, or Crow Indian Reservation in Crow Agency, Montana. My dad worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. He was a forester, right, and that's where he was located. Not too long after, he transitioned into the United States Forest Service, and we moved around a lot. Right? And in fact, by the time I graduated high school, I had lived in 6 different locations. So when you ask me where I'm from, it's kind of like I'm from lots of places. Now, my parents were from upstate New York, and so we would a lot of times go back to New York for vacations, but I never lived there as a child. And so location was not really a source of identity for me. But what was a source of identity for me were 2 things. One was family. Wherever we went, our family was strong. Both our nuclear family and our association with our extended family, right? And it was a source of strength for me, especially as we were moving around a lot with things. The other component of my identity is my faith. My parents did not come from Christian households. But they got saved or accepted Christianity when I was fairly young. And it was a transformative experience in their lives. And it transformed our household and impacted us tremendously. And I grew up embracing that faith, being proud of that faith, and became a large source of who I am still today. And so you're going to see faith weave in and out of my story and play various different roles as I wrestle with how faith impacts me, as well as vocation and the choices that I make. Now, after I graduated from high school, you can see I've continued that trajectory, right? Which is kind of ironic because I'm like, I never wanted to take my kids on the same type of journey that I did. Actually read my daughter's application to graduate school about a month or so ago, and she kind of wrote some of the same things that I wrote about my childhood. I was like, oh my goodness, I didn't mean that. But I've lived in several different locations after graduating from high school, including where I went to undergrad, as well as my graduate work, including living for 4 years in South Korea. So faith and family were core aspects of my kind of personal identity, but largely I want to tell a story about my vocational identity. Starting when I graduated from high school and decided to go to an engineering school. Now, it's interesting, if you are a teenager and you have good analytical skills and you're good at math and you walk into your high school guidance office, they will typically say, you look like an engineer. That's an engineering profile. And that was an okay profile for me because I was like, I read about engineering. I was like, this seems like something I'd be interested in. And I gladly pursued it. So I went to engineering school at Clarkson University, which if you've never heard of Clarkson, you're probably like most people in the country. But it is a very small, quite good engineering school way up in northern New York. And I was happy about my decision because having moved around a lot and not having locational identity, I thought my vocational identity was very much a destination. I was going to choose a major, and that's what I was going to be, right? And I have arrived in terms of my vocation. And so I was very happy to start university, and because I felt like, man, this is who I'm going to be. Something really interesting happened to me, though, as I began my undergraduate career. I was out on my own, and although faith was a large component of my life, faith blossomed even more in my life, and I started to feel a fervor for my faith that I hadn't experienced up to that point. And I started to wonder, man, maybe I should go into ministry, right? Maybe is God calling me because I'm feeling this excitement for my faith that I had never really experienced before, and I began to wrestle with it. So it's interesting that my faith, right, also is all of a sudden is taking me in a very different direction than what I had anticipated. Right? What I didn't realize, and maybe completely obvious to everyone in this room, is that our vocation is not a destination. It's a journey. And this tension was just the first of many areas where I would be able to wrestle with and make decisions along that journey. I really resonated in our continuing program with a quote I came across that says, anytime you are doing what you need to do, you are fulfilling your vocation. We are participating in what God is doing. And I didn't really know what God was doing at that point, but I was open to the possibilities. And so after graduating from Clarkson, I went to Philadelphia, and I went with my wife, right? And that was my wife and I, who we met in college. She didn't graduate from engineering college. She graduated from the music college across town. And but we got married shortly after graduating. We moved to Philly, and I started a job as an engineer. But I also started a job as a volunteer staff person at a church in Philadelphia. And in some ways, right, this was almost like a competing hypothesis. Like, we'll see what one happens here. And if you'd asked me to predict what hypothesis would be successful, I would have thought it was going to be the ministry option. I thought that was going to blossom, and then eventually I would just move from engineering into ministry, and that's what would happen. What I didn't realize is there was actually a third hypothesis that I should have considered. And at the time, I was involved in Bible studies and different aspects of leadership where I was engaging in a fair amount of teaching at a micro level. And what I really discovered, and probably what I should have paid attention to, it also happened during my undergrad, is that I really enjoyed teaching, right? And it was like this flower that just began to bloom in my life, and I was like, man, I love this. I can't ignore this. This is what I want to do. And then I started to wrestle with, well, do I want to teach engineering? I couldn't see myself doing that. I liked doing engineering, but I was like, I don't think I could teach it. Should I go to seminary and teach there? But that didn't seem right. But as I was working in organizations, I really got fascinated with people processes. I saw the importance of people, and especially leadership. It's like, man, I really would like to understand this, because I think understanding this and teaching this, I could have an impact in nonprofit organizations like churches, but also I could have an impact in businesses as well. And so I began to research PhD programs and everything that goes on in that, and I decided, or say, okay, if I want to do this, I gotta get a PhD. I probably got to teach at a college level, and so I began to explore this. And I was like, okay, I'm going to turn away or pivot away from engineering, and so I kind of left that identity behind me. The ministry one, or the faith component, came with me, and I thought it might circle back at some point, but I wasn't exactly sure how. So I made the move into academia. Decided to go to a PhD program at Cornell University in organizational behavior, and I started on this academic journey. Now, if you're familiar with PhD programs, especially in the business area, they're heavily based on research. Research is primary. You go to places that are top research institutions, right? You don't really talk about teaching, because they are all about research, and research is the measure of success. Publications are the measure of success. All the top people in the field are not known for being great teachers, they are known for being great researchers and publishing. And what I found in my PhD program, I knew research was a part of the game. I had researched PhD programs, and I was fully on board with doing research. I'm analytical. I like math, right? I was like, there's some things that really resonated with me about this, and I was excited about doing research, especially in my area of people processes and leadership. But what I didn't realize is that teaching was almost a bit of a dirty word. You didn't really talk about it. Everyone did it, but they wished that they were allocating more time to research, and I couldn't really talk about it out in the open. So here's something very interesting. The very reason that I went to a PhD program is because I was interested in teaching, and yet I find myself on a career where the very thing that drew me to that is the very thing I can't really talk about. And so I feel like teaching, this aspect of teaching in my identity is a threat to my vocational identity. And I don't know exactly how to reconcile this in my life, but I'm on this path, and I figure at some point I might figure it out. So I continue on this journey, and during graduate school, the family component became prominent. In fact, my own nuclear family, actually I had two of my daughters were born during graduate school, my older two, and my youngest daughter was born shortly after we took my first position in Korea. So I graduated from Cornell, and I went to South Korea. My first position was at the SKK Graduate School of Business, which was actually very interesting. It was a business school startup in partnership with MIT. and it had very strong research ambitions. It was modeled after top research institutions in the United States. And so in terms of culture, it was very much what I had left at Cornell. I was in South Korea for 4 years, and for a variety of reasons, I had to come back stateside, and I came to Ohio State and spent 6 years at Ohio State. Now, during this time, I was still wrestling with this idea of what is success in my career. What role should research be? What role should teaching be? And all the incentives in my career are based on research and publications. Yet, I was teaching, right, during this time. And you know what? Didn't say it too loud. I loved it. Right? It was fantastic. I was like, man, I thought I was going to like teaching. I got into this because of teaching, and I loved teaching. Right? And I was like, what do I do with this? Because if I move off of this path, right, there are significant career implications for me in terms of thinking about success and how others will view me in terms of how successful they think that I am. And for that, I thought I'd give another quote that I thought was very interesting. And it said, God's primary call for our lives is not success, but faithfulness. And I think this is where my faith really started to play a role, where I was realizing, man, God, you have me on this path, right? You determine levels of success, right? Am I successful in your eyes? And you've birthed this idea of teaching in my heart. And I want to be faithful to what you've placed into my heart. And so I made a very significant pivot once again off this track. And I decided I was going to emphasize teaching more in my career. Now, at this point, I still had a choice to make. Ohio State actually liked some of my teaching, and they said, we'd like to keep you, and they offered me a clinical position there. Teaching at Ohio State is very different than teaching at other places. When I would teach there, I would routinely teach classrooms of 300 students, and sometimes have almost up to 1,000 students in a semester. It was like putting on a show, right? I'd come in, and it was very, it was almost like entertainment in many respects, which was kind of fun. I also would teach MBAs, and so graduate students, and I enjoyed aspects of that. I knew there are different areas for teaching as well, and eventually what I decided is that I wanted to not just teach to convey information, I wanted to engage. I wanted to engage with students, and I wanted to be involved in developing students, and for that, liberal arts institutions really appealed to me with a focus on development and thinking broadly. And so I began to explore liberal arts institutions, and what I especially wanted was a place that still valued teaching, yet research was still on the table, and a place where there was balance between the two. And so I ended up going to Ithaca College, and I'm just gonna say, it was a freeing experience. I didn't realize what a weight it had been on me. And I walked through the halls at Ithaca, right, and I could have teaching conversations with my colleagues, right, and we would explore teaching methods, and they still valued me because of what I brought to the table with regards for research. And I was like, my goodness. Someone's like, Matt, you are so stupid. Why didn't you do this before? Right? Because it was just an exhilarating experience. And I was like, my goodness, there's an affirmation of the choice that I made. Now, I'm going to pivot here, right? And this is what I wrestled with, but there's also something that was going alongside of this the whole way. And I don't want to make research seem like the enemy here, because I did embrace research. Research was important to me. I wanted to understand people processes, especially leadership. And so research is something that's carried along with me throughout my vocational journey. It's just its level of emphasis has shifted at various points. But I want to just kind of talk about my exploration as a researcher as well, because it is an important part of who I am. Now, there's some things that you can't get out of me. I was an engineer as an undergrad, and some of that will probably never exit from me. And engineers are problem solvers. We like to fix things. And as I began to explore research, I was like, what do I really want to do? There's so many areas I could focus on, and even leadership itself is a very broad field, and I didn't really know, but I started to look around and look at where are there leadership problems, right? And where can I explore and learn and understand and maybe contribute. And one area that really struck my interest was this area of credit sharing and credit taking. Right? This is not a new area. There are Chinese proverbs that are thousands of years old talking about sharing and taking credit. But I was really interested in how this plays out in organizations and understand how it's viewed theoretically, and it turns out that credit is a valuable resource in organizations. People need it on the journey to success and promotion and advancement, and therefore it's important to be recognized and to get credit. And I was really interested in this idea that, there's typical advice is to share credit, but credit's something that people need. And what we know from social psychology is that people engage in a self-serving bias, and they tend to take credit. And what is interesting to me is also in some types of organizations, credit taking is routine. For example, you in the legal field or in finance, it's just expected that at certain levels of your career or stages of your career, right, you're not going to get credit. Your boss is going to take credit for things that even you did, right, without even mentioning your name. And I was interested in how this plays out. How do people respond to this? And I began to explore this idea of expectations and what do people expect in terms of credit. Do they expect credit? Or do they not expect credit? And how does this affect responses? And it turns out that if people, what they expect, they tend to be okay with. If they expect to not get credit, like they might in the legal field, they're generally okay with it. But what we also know is that when leaders exceed expectations, especially in sharing credit, right, it has extraordinary results and positive impacts on employees. And so I published a couple of papers in this area, and what often happens with researchers, right, you tend to follow a stream and similar ideas, but unfortunately I hop around a lot, and I started getting interested in other leadership problems. And when I was in South Korea, there was a couple of researchers, and we started talking about what happens with leaders in organizations, and we got really interested in the concept of failure. Right? We didn't look at when leaders fail or how they respond to it. What we're interested in is what happens when a leader is potentially facing failure. In other words, you got the train coming down the tracks at you. How does the leader respond? What type of decisions do they make? Now, you may expect, right, when bad things are coming, leaders would want to fix the problem. They would want to solve what's going wrong so we can make things right. But in this research, what we found is that leaders don't do that. They tend to focus a lot on managing reputation, the reputation of the firm, impression management, sometimes even unethical behavior during these times. They don't tend to focus the resources toward fixing the problem. And so in some ways they perpetuate the problem and don't act to fix it like we would hope that they would. Or that maybe you could even argue that they should do in these situations. So I have these two areas, and they feel very different to me. Right? And so as I'm trying to think about bios, I'm like, oh gosh, how do these things connect with one another? And I can't even remember what type of story I crafted to try to connect those things. But shortly after this area, which I published a few papers in, I had another idea, right? About how leaders respond to followers that don't embrace their leadership. I'd encountered a number of leaders where they were frustrated because they're like, man, I'm a leader and the people around me just don't embrace how awesome of a leader I am. And they just don't seem to get it. And I was looking at their responses, I'm like, what is the psychology of a leader, right, who's facing these type of experiences? And what we know from leadership research is that it's very important for leaders to be perceived as part of the group, on the part of subordinates. Subordinates have to see the leader as part of the group in order for them to embrace that leader's direction and influence. But what happens when that's not the case? When the leader feels that the group is not embracing them as part of the group? And developed this idea, borrowing from social psychology on identity threat, and come up with this idea of leader identity threat, where a person views themselves as a leader, but that leader identity feels threatened. And what are the implications of that for the groups that they're leading? Turns out it hurts performance. It hurts effectiveness. Again, once you would think, okay, a leader, right? They're not embracing me, I need to fix the problem, but what we find is that leaders tend to feel threatened and actually do engage in behaviors that almost perpetuate the problem, right? And it hurts the group. Just published this paper actually several months ago. And now this final paper was kind of a labor of love. It took a long time, but as I'm involved in engaging in this research, I realize it starts to dawn on me. I mean, you might already see it, but I'm pretty thick, and so all of a sudden I realized, man, Matt, you're kind of interested in this idea of threat, things that threaten leaders from not getting credit that would allow them to be successful, to failure, which is a big threat to a leader's career and success, and then we got explicitly threat here. And I was like, man, it seems like you are drawn to these situations where leaders are experiencing threatening situations. And so I have this narrative, and in fact, in coming to Hope, what I'm really excited about, right, is I recognize who I am, but I want to say what I'd love to do, and I've begun doing, is actually exploring this more from the angle of developing leaders who can respond effectively to threatening situations. And I started a project a couple years ago with a student, and we're looking at self-regulation process in leaders, where it's about self-control and leaders actually being able to do the types of things that they need to do when they're facing these types of situations. And what I love about Hope is this idea of faith in this, and the Bible talks a lot about self-control. And so this paper actually brings in that as a component of thinking about how do we develop leaders that can respond effectively to this. And I'm really thinking broadly about other aspects. What are leadership processes? And I think there's aspects of authenticity that are ripe for exploration, that can, where we can look at how people can be developed to help to respond effectively and do the types of things that they should do, even under difficult circumstances. Now, in some ways, I think it's ironic that I'm interested in this idea of threat, because I feel like I've lived it out with various parts of my identity as I've gone along through my career. And I think the one area that I haven't discussed as much is this area of faith. Right? Faith has stayed with me this entire process, but in this academic journey, faith hasn't always been something that I felt like I've been able to wear on my sleeve. And I think it's actually become much more difficult. One thing that I loved about my graduate program is actually being able to explore diverse opinions and ideas. There still was this idea of secularism, and faith wasn't embraced that much, but I felt like I could have conversations. But as I proceeded throughout my career, I felt like that it's become much more narrow in terms of how I could express my faith. And in fact, I felt like at times in my faith, it's like this part of my identity that I've had to keep secret. I have this public-facing part of me in my job where I can express aspects of who I am as a teacher and a researcher, but my faith, I have to be very targeted how I express it. And that's worn on me over time. And I felt like, my goodness, my faith in some ways is a threat to my career. If I express it, what's going to happen to me? What are the implications of this? And it's never like I would say that I'm not a Christian, but it was there, and I felt like there was this privatization of my faith that I was uncomfortable with, but I didn't know how to reconcile. Right? And I think many people in lots of different disciplines, even outside of academia, wrestle with this. But I was uncomfortable with it. I didn't quite know how to deal with it. And I think this quote says that if faith is important to you, you have to find a way to balance it. How do you reconcile it? How can you live out your faith in an effective way? How is it going to play a role in your identity? I think it's fascinating to me how different people reconcile with this. I'm not sure there's a right way. But I'll just say this. The answer for me was hope. I felt freeing coming to Ithaca College in terms of being able to teach and research. I felt the same thing in making the decision to come to Hope. I felt it was a place where I got what I had previously, where this balance of teaching and research, where teaching's important, but I felt like I got another part of my identity that has been with me since I was very young, is now unshackled in some ways. And I remember the first time being in the classroom and talking about business and God's design for us to flourish, how business plays a role in that. And I walked out of that classroom and I felt like I was walking on the clouds. I was like, my goodness, this is an area that I've been missing. And I found fulfillment in this process. Now, I'm not to argue that this is the way that it is that everyone should respond to this, but it is a way that has worked for me. And I've been very thankful for what Hope has been able to offer me as a component of my identity. And that may be cliche, this is our mission at Hope, but I think it particularly resonates with me. And then if you think about me, leadership is a part of my research, but also leadership now, where I see it going, is part of development process. Right? And I've been involved in the Baker Scholars, which is a leadership development program, and I love being involved in that. But I'm also seeing my research being a component of that, and my time in the classroom being as a part of that as well. And for the first time in my career, now that last part is there as well, faith. Niawaha, thank you.
Okay, friends, this mic is a problem, so we're not going to use it.
Dr. Rodgers, I would love for people to engage with your presentation a little bit. Would you be willing to repeat back the question that they asked a little bit from your mic, so on video we can catch it?
Yeah, I'll try to do that.
That'd be great.
Yes.
Who would like to start us?
I can start.
Yeah.
So, from a young age, you pivoted many times with moving, and then even in your
Yeah.
professional career, you pivoted a lot. And you talked about how you kind of, when you felt the right time and when you realized to pivot, but when you're kind of changing your environment constantly, how do you deal with that uncertainty when you're going into a new environment, new people, a new place? Kind of how do you ground yourself, and how do you kind of consistently profess your faith in new areas?
Yeah. So the question is, well, when you enter new environments, like different ones that I've encountered, right? how do you deal with that uncertainty? How do you ground yourself? For me, I have a lot of conversations with God through the process. I took a little step that I think is not, I didn't really mention here. As I moved from engineering into business, I had never taken a business course before. And here I hopped in with just as an engineering undergrad into a business PhD program. And I found myself in seminars with people who had business degrees. Some of them MBAs, some of them just business undergraduates, but they've been talking about these things for several years. And it was incredibly uncertain. There was a ton of self-doubt, right? And for me, I think there's two things. One, as you're making those transitions, we're never completely certain. But to remember that there was a lot of research, there was a lot of prayer before I made a transition, and to remember those times when you're in the middle of the uncertainty. Say, yes, I remember that. These are stakes in the ground. I know that I'm here for a reason, despite the self-doubt. And to also know that God's with you in the process, right? And that God, you brought me here, help me through this process, right? Because there was a few times I was like, am I crazy? I'm reading articles, like these academic articles. I don't know what these terms mean. I look in the dictionary, they're not in the dictionary. I'm like, what on earth is up with these academics? They're making up words. What's going on here? Right? And so, I felt lost for a bit. Yeah.
I have a question kind of like what you were just talking about when you switched to engineering. I feel like sometimes it's hard because you said like you had the right skill set to be a good engineer, and sometimes it's hard discerning like, oh, I'm just good at these things versus something that's like really fulfilling. So how did you, like, in terms of your identity, shift from being like, oh, like I know I'm really good at like math, science, sort of deductive reasoning versus just switching to business, and how did you not let that, I guess, impact your identity when engineering seems like it was part of it?
Yeah. So the question is, you're good at certain things, even if you might not like necessarily enjoy those types of things, and how do you work through that in terms of your identity? I mean, I think for me, it's a couple of areas. I think it's your skills, right? And even though I was wired for engineering in some ways, that skill set translates to other domains as well, right? In some ways, probably my guidance counselor didn't give me as broad of a view as maybe they could have, right? So there are other areas where where my skills matched. I think it's where skills meet your passion, right? And you could see that flowering I talked about with teaching, it just bloomed, and it was like something that I just couldn't get away from in my head. And I think the other thing too is a bit opportunity. So I'll just give you a little peek behind the curtain. And I'm not sure this is the wisest decision in the world, but as I was exploring PhD programs in Philadelphia, my wife and I found out that we were expecting our first child, and I almost pulled the plug. I was like, I'm not sure we can have a child in a graduate program. I don't know how this is gonna work. And my parents probably gave me the best piece of advice at that point. They said, it's never going to be a right time to do this. You need to plunge forward, because you might not take this step if you wait, and if God's calling you to that, you need to do that. So I did something, if you're familiar with the story of Gideon in the Bible, right, who lays a fleece to get God's direction. And so I laid a little bit of a fleece, right? It wasn't, it's in that I said, you know what, I want to take this step, but if we're going to do this, I need family involved in this process. And so we mapped out an area around my wife's family in upstate New York, and we said, okay, here are 3 schools, and I'm going to take 3 schools. I'm going to take a top tier one, I'm going to take a mid tier one, and I'm going to take one that are a lower tier, and I'm just going to apply, right? And PhD programs have remarkably low acceptance rates, even for lower tier places. It's hard to get into these places, and so I was legitimately thought that there's a chance I might not get into any of them. I'm an engineering undergrad going into a business program. I mean, I have self-doubt about whether I what they'll think of me. And so I was like, okay, God, if you open the doors, make this happen, and I ended up getting into all three of them, and it was a real affirmation for me. And then I had to decide which one, but I was for me it was like, okay, passion and skill meets opportunity, right? And I was like, there was this affirmation as to okay, what God's been doing, the skills that I have, now there's an open door to be able to make that happen. I think you got to be careful with that a little bit, but in an interesting way, it's kind of unfolded for me that way.
If you were to fast forward to the end of your career, what are 1 to 2 things that you want students and colleagues to say about Matt?
Okay, so the question is, what are 1 or 2 things I want students or colleagues to say about me at the end of my career? So what I'm really regretting right now is for training bakers to ask really good questions. Because I think they are having lots of fun right now, right? Saying, how can we put Matt in the hot seat? I think, one of my greatest joys, wherever I've worked, right, even as I've wrestled with identity and that type of thing, one of the greatest joys in my work life is the people that I'm around, right? They make or break everything, right? And what I want people to say about my career is that I'm a person that they enjoyed being around, that I was a good colleague, that I supported them, right? And I also think, you look at this journey, and a lot of times it's a journey toward authenticity. And what I would love for people to say about me is that I was, not only that I was a good colleague, that I loved people, I cared about people, but I was authentic in who I was as an individual, in the way I interacted people, the way I treated people, but especially with regards to my faith, that I tried to live out my faith, probably not perfectly, definitely not perfectly, but I tried to live it out in a way that was real and demonstrated what Christ has done for me.
I'm wondering about, throughout your career, like any leaders or mentors that have played a key role in your development, and then also traits about them that you really admire and hope to pass on to others.
Yeah. I think there were 2, I think, leaders that I think had an impact on me. One was a pastor that I had in Philadelphia who really just believed in me, right? And especially at times where I was doubting myself and my own value. And he also was one that introduced me to leadership. And we had lots of conversations about leadership and its importance. And so in some ways, I think he sparked some of the flame that burned in me with regards to my interest in leadership. There was another leader as an engineer, and I guess what I think he was probably one of the first leaders that I'd encounter where faith was really a part of how he lived his life and how he led, right? It was just on his sleeve in the way he treated people, the way he treated me, right, as his subordinate, right, made me just want to be around him, right? And he was incredibly supportive of me, especially in that process of getting a PhD and encouraging me there. And I think both exemplify this idea of just believing in people, right? And I think that's one thing I notice, especially interactions with students. Sometimes I'm guilty of this, like I have lots of self-doubt and self-limiting beliefs, right? If you had asked me, right, would I have gotten to any of those PhD programs? I probably would have said no. In fact, I was the most surprised of anybody around me that I got into it, because I didn't believe in myself. In fact, I considered not even applying because I was like, no, there's no way. But we self-limit. Sometimes we don't believe in our capabilities. And talking with lots of students, I try to fan that flame. You have more in you sometimes than you ever could think you could be. And I think it's important also, I think, going back to this idea of mentors, right? Finding people that maybe believe in you more than you believe in yourself.
Well, friends, I just want to say, in wrap up today, I've really enjoyed the time I've gotten to spend with Dr. Rodgers. So that's true for me. I really enjoy the questions these Baker scholars are asking to think something is good is happening here. But thank you for your presentation today. Wonderful to hear more about you, your journey, and then how you think and the work you're doing here at Hope. So thank you. Will you join me in thanking Dr. Rodgers?